If you asked most people to name the most genetically African country on Earth, Ethiopia would be near the top of the list. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions in the world. It is the country where the oldest known anatomically modern human fossils were found. It sits in the Horn of Africa, surrounded on three sides by the continent it belongs to. Its people have lived there for tens of thousands of years. By every measure of history, geography, and culture, Ethiopia is African. So why, when you plot Ethiopian DNA on a global genetic chart, does it sit between Africa and the Middle East, measurably closer to Syrians and Yemenis than to Nigerians and Congolese? That is not a visual trick. That is what the chromosome data shows, and the answer reaches back 3,000 years to a migration that almost nobody in mainstream history talks about. A wave of people who crossed the Red Sea in the wrong direction, entered Africa from the north, and rewrote the genomes of an entire region so completely that the signal is still detectable in every Ethiopian alive today. This is the Ethiopian Paradox, and to understand it, you need to understand what Africa looked like genetically before the crossing happened. Think of Sub-Saharan Africa as a genetic continent: West Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa. The populations vary in language, culture, and history, but underneath all of it, there is a thread of shared ancestry connecting them. That thread has a name: the Bantu expansion. Beginning roughly 3,000 years ago in what is now Cameroon, Bantu-speaking agricultural populations spread outward across sub-Saharan Africa in one of the most successful demographic events in all of human prehistory. They carried their language, their farming technology, and their DNA. They reached the Congo Basin, they reached South Africa, they reached Kenya and Tanzania. Over roughly 1,500 years, the Bantu expansion genetically unified vast stretches of the continent, creating the Sub-Saharan cluster that modern geneticists recognize when they map African populations. This is why a Nigerian and a Kenyan are genetically more similar to each other than to an Ethiopian, not because their histories are the same, but because the same population wave passed through both of them, but it never reached Ethiopia. The Ethiopian highlands stopped it cold. The altitude, the terrain, and the populations already established there created a wall the Bantu expansion could not penetrate. While the rest of sub-Saharan Africa was being genetically unified from the west, Ethiopia was receiving something completely different, from the opposite direction entirely. Here is the history lesson almost nobody teaches. Roughly 10 miles separate the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula at a narrow strait called Bab-el-Mandeb. In Arabic, the name means Gate of Tears. For most of human history, that gap was not a barrier. It was a corridor. Peoples moved in both directions, out of Africa into Arabia during the great ancient migrations, and back from Arabia into Africa during the movements that came after. Approximately 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, genetic studies date a major wave of West Eurasian peoples entering the Horn of Africa from the north and northwest. These were not scattered traders or small bands of merchants. Research from the University of Cambridge suggests this migration could have represented as much as 30% of the population already living in the Horn at the time. They brought wheat, they brought barley, they brought lentils, and they brought their DNA in quantities large enough to fundamentally reshape every Ethiopian genome that descended from them. The impact is visible in every direction you look. Modern Ethiopian Semitic and Cushitic speakers, the Amhara, the Tigrinya, the Oromo, carry maternal mitochondrial lineages that are almost equally split between sub-Saharan African haplogroups and Eurasian haplogroups, not 70% African with a Eurasian trace. Roughly 50-50. The same near-equal split appears in the Y chromosome data, the paternal lines. In genetic terms, the Ethiopian Highlander is not an African with a Eurasian footnote. They are a synthesis, a new population built from two worlds that met at the Gate of Tears and fused over centuries of intermarriage. This is why, on a global genetic chart, Ethiopian populations do not cluster with Nigerians or Congolese. They sit equidistant, between sub-Saharan Africa and the Levant, belonging to neither cluster entirely and both clusters partially. The chart is not wrong, it is reading the genome correctly. And the person who proved exactly when this transformation happened is a man who died 4,500 years ago and was buried face down in a cave. In 2012, archaeologists John and Catherine Arthur of the University of South Florida were led by local Gamo elders to a cave called Mota in the southwestern Ethiopian highlands. Inside, they found a skeleton, an adult male buried face down, alone, approximately 4,500 years ago. The cave's cool, dry highland air had preserved something extraordinary, enough DNA in the dense bone of his inner ear for a full genome sequence. When researchers at the University of Cambridge analyzed the Mota man's genome, they understood immediately what they were holding. Mota had lived 4,500 years ago, predating the Eurasian back migration into East Africa by roughly 1,500 years. His genome was pure, uncontaminated by the wave that would arrive after him. He represented, as precisely as science could measure, what Ethiopian DNA looked like before the Gate of Tears opened in that direction. And when they compared Mota's genome to the genomes of modern Ethiopians, the scale of what had changed became visible for the first time. The Eurasian back migration had been suspected from indirect evidence for years. Mota gave researchers a clean before and after comparison. Cambridge geneticist Andrea Manica described the finding. The wave of West Eurasian migration into the Horn of Africa could have been as much as 30% of the existing population, and that signal then spread through subsequent African migrations, reaching populations as far away as the Yoruba of West Africa and the Mbuti of the Congo. The signal saturated East Africa and left subtle genetic ripples across the continent's interior. But the Mota discovery revealed something the migration story alone could never explain. Because while the genes were mixing at sea level, the highlands were running a completely different experiment on the people who climbed them and stayed. To live for thousands of years in the Ethiopian highlands, the roof of Africa, sitting above 12,000 feet, requires more than endurance. It requires a biological rewrite. Most humans brought to that altitude within days begin to struggle. The body panics. It floods the bloodstream with extra red blood cells, trying to compensate for the thinning air. The blood thickens. The heart strains. Without intervention, the result is altitude sickness, organ stress, and in extreme cases, death. Every high-altitude population on Earth developed an answer to this problem. Tibetans carry variants in a gene called EPAS1, the so-called superathlete gene, that suppress red blood cell overproduction. Andean populations took a different route entirely, simply tolerating thicker blood through enlarged hearts and higher baseline hemoglobin. Two different solutions to the same problem. The Ethiopian genome found a third way, one that nobody expected. Deep within the DNA of the Amhara and the Oromo, scientists have identified unique variants in genes including eDNRA and CPAS1, variants found in no other high-altitude population on Earth. These do not work the way Tibetan or Andean adaptations work. Ethiopian highlanders maintain normal, thin blood at oxygen levels that would cause cardiovascular stress in others. They do not flood the bloodstream. They do not thicken. They simply breathe efficiently where other bodies cannot. Not a workaround, a better architecture. In 2026, as African-led genomic initiatives take the lead in studying their own populations on their own terms, researchers are beginning to understand just how significant this is. For decades, Ethiopian altitude adaptation was framed as a comparison. How does it differ from Tibet, from the Andes? The emerging African genomic perspective asks a different question. What does this adaptation reveal about the specific pressures of the Ethiopian highlands over thousands of years? And what else does the genome carry that Western-centric research frameworks have not yet thought to look for? The altitude chapter is not a footnote to the Ethiopian Paradox. It is its most extreme expression. The same crossroads geography that brought populations together from opposite ends of the human world also placed those people in one of the most physiologically demanding landscapes on Earth. The genome had to adapt to both pressures simultaneously, mixing and surviving, synthesizing, and enduring. The result is a biology that is, in the most literal sense, built for conditions no other human population on Earth has had to master in quite the same way. But here is what the altitude adaptation, remarkable as it is, still cannot account for. The genetic anomaly in Ethiopia goes deeper than the back migration and deeper than the mountains, far deeper, because below the Eurasian layer and below the altitude signatures, older and quieter, is something that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Ethiopian genetic diversity is the highest of any single country population in the world. More internal genetic variation exists within Ethiopia than exists across the entire continent of Europe. The Omotic-speaking peoples of the southwestern highlands carry lineages so old and so distinct that some researchers propose they represent a completely separate ancient African population stratum, a human presence in that landscape that predates the movements that shaped every other population around them. The Nilotic groups in the west connect genetically to the Nile Valley world. The Semitic highlanders carry the Eurasian signal. The Cushitic speakers sit between all of them, genetically synthesizing every layer at once. A single country contains what would normally require a continent to hold, and then the language confirmed everything the DNA had already said. Most Ethiopians speak Afro-Asiatic languages: Amharic, Tigrinya, Oromo, Somali. The Afro-Asiatic family is one of the oldest language families on Earth. Its Semitic branch, the branch that includes Amharic and Tigrinya, connects directly to southern Arabia, to the same geographic direction from which the Eurasian back migration arrived. The people who crossed the Gate of Tears brought their language with them. It took root in the highlands and spread, leaving Ethiopia today as the only country in Sub-Saharan Africa whose dominant languages are more closely related to Arabic and Hebrew than to Swahili or Yoruba. This is the convergent confirmation that researchers call their strongest evidence. When genetics, archaeology, and linguistics all point at the same event from independent directions, the probability of coincidence collapses to nearly zero. 3 different evidence tracks, built from completely different data, all arrive at the same Gate of Tears, the same 3,000-year crossing, the same population that entered Africa and rebuilt the Horn from the inside. DNA, bones, language, all telling the same story, which brings the Ethiopian paradox to its real significance, the one that goes beyond a data anomaly on a genetic chart. Africa gave humanity to the world. Every non-African person alive today traces their ancestry to a departure from this continent, through the Horn of Africa or across the Sinai tens of thousands of years ago. That is the story everyone learns. What nobody adds is what came next. Some of those descendants came back. 3,000 years ago, following the same corridor their ancestors had used to leave, a population descended from the Neolithic farmers who had first settled Europe returned to the Horn of Africa. They crossed the Gate of Tears and merged with the people who had stayed. The result is the Ethiopian genome, a record of humanity moving in both directions through the same narrow strait, separated by 40,000 years, and meeting again on the African side. No other population on Earth holds that specific convergence. No other country sits on that particular historical hinge. Ethiopia is not an anomaly on the genetic map. It is the map's most honest point, the place where the out of Africa story and the back to Africa story fold back onto each other and become the same story. What does it mean for human origins when the oldest homeland on Earth turns out to be a crossroads? The next time you look at a map and see Ethiopia, you are not looking at a distant country with an unusual genome. You are looking at the place where your own story, whoever you are, wherever you come from, passed through on its way to becoming you. Thanks for watching.